Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So today's webinar will be covering off SQL 2012 licensing changes and the new features of SQL 2014. So today we're joined by Neil and Richard from North Door, and we've got Jack Watson here from Bytes Software Services.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending today. We've got a great turnout. I believe there was over 200 people that registered for this event, so I suspect there's a lot of people listening, so I appreciate your time. So some of you will know me. So my name is Richard Hartill. I work for North Door, and North Door are a partner of Bytes when it comes to helping Bytes and helping Bytes customers with queries around SQL. I'll give you a little bit of background as to North Door. So we're an IT consultancy organisation. We're based in the City of London. We've been established for 25 years, and we're a preferred Microsoft SQL partner. As you would expect, we have the accreditations to sort of be able to have that affiliation. So we have a gold accreditation in data platform with Microsoft, a gold accreditation in application development, a gold accreditation in business intelligence, and also a gold accreditation in portal and collaboration, which is effectively SharePoint. The reason we felt this would be an interesting webinar for Bytes' customer base is the queries that we were getting from Bytes account managers when they're talking to their customers, but also the conversations that we're having with our own customers with regards to the changes with regards to the licensing model with SQL and the fact that it's now based on core rather than what it was previously. And off the back of that, we believe that it's very important for organisations to now review their SQL estates to make sure that they're getting optimum value and performance from the money they're spending on their SQL licensing. Often that involves looking and perhaps auditing the existing SQL estate with a view to getting a clear understanding of what the organisation has at that particular moment in time, with a view to then working with a partner like Bytes, who have a huge amount of experience when it comes to licensing and understanding licensing, and a partner like ourselves who can engage with perhaps looking at redesigning the estate to make sure that you're not overspending on licensing, that it's correctly licensed, and you're getting all of the value from the new features and functionality of the latest versions of SQL 2014. So today, Jack Watson is going to be covering off information on the changes to licensing and what that means for everybody. And then Jack will be handing over to Neil Hambley, who will also be talking about what's changed in SQL in terms of features, functionality, and also how you might approach a project where you might be looking to evaluate your current estate to optimize that value. So on that basis, I'll hand over to you, Jack.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning to everybody. I'm going to launch straight into it and look at the licensing changes, models and additions of 2014. And with the release of SQL 2014 in April of this year, Microsoft have really changed the lineup of the 4 main volume licensing editions and how they are licensed. So this table, I'm just going to talk over the slides rather than talk what's on the slides throughout the 15 minutes of covering the licensing section of this 2012 and 2014 conversation. And first and foremost, Standard Edition maintains its ability to be licensed in the server CAL model, but it is now available under the new per core licensing metric under both 2012 and in today's 2014 guise. Business Intelligence Edition is licensed only in the server CAL model, but the big change and the one that perhaps is most significant to many of you joining us in the webinar today is the Enterprise Edition, formerly available in per server and per processor models, but is now only available in a per core licensing metric. And this represents a huge change and impact on SQL licensing costs as well as the ongoing OPEX for many of our customers. And at a high level, this is what you've got to watch out for 2014 and any new licenses that you're purchasing. The new failover rights for physical servers in active-passive mode, the importance of maintaining active software assurance for virtualized environments, And if you are virtualizing and haven't got software assurance, please do get in touch with us in the form of the feedback forms and the Q&A post this webinar, because we'd really like to talk to you because there's significant risks as well as opportunities within that space. The new core licensing model significantly impacts new deployments and upgrades, and as well as the licensing agreements and hardware decisions that you might need to make. So anybody with any customers with over quad-core processors may be in for a significant change due to this new core licensing metric. And that's something that we're going to explore a little bit further on today's webinar. The SQL Enterprise licenses, or the legacy licensing entitlements, what we really want to do is drill into the topology of your SQL estate and see how your licensing maps onto that, because there's a phenomenal amount of opportunity to reduce spend. There are a lot of customers out there spending a great deal of their software budget on SQL licensing, and it really is worth the time to go down into a granular level to understand it in a better way. So at this stage, just wanted to launch a polling question for the webinar, whether you currently have active software assurance, and just an opportunity for everybody to vote yes or no, so we can get a flavour and an understanding for those on the call today as to which of those two camps you may fall into.
So the poll results have come back, and 67% do currently have software assurance and 33% don't.
Lovely, thank you, Sarah. So a whistle-stop tour of the licensing metrics that underpin SQL 2014. In server cow mode, you license the server that you have installed SQL on and any of its components, whether that be reporting or analysis services. If you separate out these components, you still need the license for every single physical or virtual install. Then you require either a license for users or devices for every single user or device that can potentially access this particular SQL server. The key is to be wary of multiplexing environments where SQL is the back-end database for an application, because you'll need SQL cows for this level of access. And Microsoft don't allow you to limit the licensing repercussions of this unless you're using Business Intelligence Edition. Now the new core model, effectively what I'll do is break this down into both a physical and a virtual implications. Under the new per core licensing model, each server running SQL Server 2014 software or any of its components must be assigned an appropriate number of SQL Server 2014 core licenses. So looking at the physical side of things, you have to license all the physical cores, you have to license all physical processes with a minimum of 4 cores, and when licensing on the per core licensing metric, you negate the need for SQL cow licenses, so it's a really good fit for externally facing servers. And here's a key change: you need active software assurance for passive failover. Anyone upgrading or renewing software assurance or buying a new SQL 2014 license will be affected. Virtualization is commonly seen as the most complex licensing scenario, but in isolation it's not as difficult as Microsoft perhaps make out. There are 2 ways of licensing SQL in a virtual environment. The first is licensing SQL per VM or per license host. When licensing per VM, all you have to do is ensure you license the number of virtual cores that are assigned to that particular machine. So you've got to take care to cover the minimum of 4 cores for every single virtual machine of SQL Server installation. And you buy with software assurance for the SA mobility. So if you're using, I take the example of VMware, something like DRS, whereby you can move the virtual machines from one host to another. Software assurance is required in order to do that, unless you're restricted by the 90-day reassignment rights of the licenses themselves. Now if you're using hyperthreading and you've got this turned on and licensing on the per VM mode, Microsoft say that every virtual core maps to each thread. So what this means is a single quad core with hyperthreading turned on means that you don't need to cover 4 cores, but actually 8. And this is something to certainly something to recognize, particularly when you look at the licensing costs that are involved. When licensing per host, you can stack the licenses to cover the total number of SQL VMs that can run on each of the hosts. If you were buying standard server license, it's licensed on a 1-for-1 basis. If you're buying Enterprise Edition, then effectively, as long as you license all the underlying core licenses within the host, you will obtain unlimited virtualization rights if you're buying with software assurance. If you buy without software assurance, then it's limited to 4 VMs for every quad-core processor that you're covered from a physical perspective. So how to maximize your SQL licensing? Well, with the volume of change that actually exists here, there's a phenomenal opportunity for us to actually drill into the license migration of anyone with active software assurance, and there's a large proportion of people on the call today who obviously fall within that category. So effectively, what we're looking at here is renewing the processor licenses into a core licensing metric and maximizing the value of core licenses that you can get through a license grant. Now typically what Microsoft allow is for you to actually take the number of physical processors or processor licenses you have under your current license agreement and then effectively do a piece of work in inventory to understand how many cores sit and underpin that particular infrastructure. At the point of expiry of your software assurance, you then have the ability to apply for a grant to get that number of core licenses moving forward. So it's very important for anybody with a software assurance renewal who's currently licensing per processor and will inevitably move to a per core licensing metric to engage and look at that licensing grant. There are opportunities to maximize your licensing in this area, and the one that I want to really flag on today's webinar is if in the instance whereby you might have a single processor license assigned to a hex core processor, you can get a license grant to cover you for those 6 cores. It doesn't have to be the 4 cores that Microsoft typically communicates in terms of a default migration from processor to core. And with the individual core costs of licensing SQL Server Enterprise on a core licensing basis, about £17,500 for a 3-year term when you include software assurance, it's a significant amount of cost savings that's available there for you. When looking at the commercial licensing solutions, I just want to draw your attention to the blue box, and the blue table on this slide shows the old processor unit licensing costs annually over a 3-year period. And for a physical 2-processor server with quad-core, the licensing cost, and this is based on a corporate entry-level Level A enterprise agreement, is £58,000. Now under the new core licensing model today, a 2-core pack license is in the region of about 5k annually, and that's about £11,500 annually for a single quad-core processor. And what we've always got to be mindful of is licensing the minimum of 2 licenses for every processor to hit that 2-core coverage. So the same server with the same specification is £69,000. That's 17% more expensive over a 3-year period. And if you're in the example whereby you actually have more cores, more than 4 core processors, and I'll take an example of a 2-processor hex core, then the total over a 3-year term is £105,000. So it significantly increases based on this core licensing metric. But there are ways to negate that as part of a software assurance renewal. Now the red table shows the old SQL Server per server license, which is now no longer available unless you have an enterprise or an EAP type enrollment or contract, and you may have fixed it a number of years ago. But for those that are eligible, you can still see the opportunity here. The same server, the same specification, but under a server cow model, it's £10,000 rather than the new licensing model in the region of £69,000, £70,000. It's exactly the same server. Assuming this is an internal server, it's an enormous saving, because we've always got to be mindful of when licensing on the enterprise per server model is SQL cows. But one would assume that you have those cow footprints already and natively within your license agreement if you're licensing under that particular metric. Now thirdly, there are opportunities to reduce software assurance and OPEX by identifying areas where software assurance may not be required. The costs for licensing active software assurance are significant, and there may be chances to eliminate the need to continue SA coverage or purchase licenses without SA, and there's a percentage of people on this webinar who are obviously already doing that. The key is to ensure that your software license agreements allow for this. Many organizations who have an EAP or a SKI contract with Microsoft may have a contractual obligation that you've got to include your entire SQL footprint with software assurance, regardless of what version you deploy and whether you've got a legacy 2005, for example, installation. Time and time again, Microsoft are coming across customers who are unaware of the contractual terms of their license agreements, and the true-up mechanism can make for a potential budgetary nightmare. Engage with Bytes if we're not managing your agreement already, so we can get a view for how you can mitigate these costs based on what your target environment is. Always remember that if you no longer are eligible for software assurance benefits, then you lose the rights to unlimited virtualization, license mobility, and the failover server rights that are now included within the 2014 licensing rules. The new core licensing model is dependent on the hardware specifications of new server deployments, and customers are increasingly using Windows flash arrays to actually consolidate their Windows Server 2012 installations with file-in memory to significantly reduce their core licensing costs. Please flag this in the feedback if you're interested for a more detailed conversation on this, because of the evolution and the advent of core-based licensing is certainly an area where it can save you a great deal of money. So overall, what I wanted to do is just touch on, before handing back over, is to touch on the overall complexity of these, because the licensing models and metrics that we've discussed may be old news to some people on these particular calls. But the kind of key thing that I wanted to zero in on was the fact that every single edition, every single version of SQL Server has, in effect, a different edition, a different licensing metric, a different product usage rights, and a different cost. And that cost will often be dictated by the type of volume license agreement that you have. So 2005 came out, and you effectively had a range of different servers and licenses that you needed to cover. 2008 then changed this again, and in the 2012 world, Microsoft made the first deployment of the core licensing model. Now, to show you how this all pulls together, if you were to purchase a license today under SQL 2014, you would have to adhere to the product usage rights and the licensing metrics of the 2014 licensing rules. And if you then use those licenses to downgrade, for example, to a SQL 2008 R2 installation, then the product usage rights that you have to adhere to are those of 2014, even though you've done a 2008 deployment. So if there are different product usage rights for every single version, how do you manage that? How do you track that? There's an enormous amount of complexity within this, and there's an opportunity for us to engage, if you indicated on the feedback forms today, to understand what those different rights are and how, when leveraging downgrade rights but also cross-edition rights, i.e. having an enterprise edition license but using it for a standard edition install, can yield a lot of value to your business. So now I just want to hand back to Neil, and Neil's going to continue with SQL Server 2012 and its capability.
Excellent. Thank you, Jack. That was an excellent overview of the licensing, the models that we now have to use in our 2012 and 2014 estates. So I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes around the capabilities of both the 2012 and 2014 versions. There's been some recent kind of enhancements to the way SQL Server is deployed, and also kind of the feature suite that we have is very rich now inside of those environments. We have a few different editions, so we have the standard, business intelligence, and enterprise editions now in both the 2012 and 2014 editions, versions that is. So I'm just going to start off with the 2012 one, because this is when we started with the enhancements to those capabilities and features. And just to let you know, my name is Neil Hambley. I'm with North Door, and I recently returned from a conference in the States on SQL Server, the largest one we have year-round. And I'm a technical expert that I kind of go into these large conferences and present, and I did a half-day technical presentation there. But I also spent a lot of time talking to the Microsoft folks as well as kind of users that were attending that around how they use in 2012 and 2014 features. So I'm going to touch on some of the things that I discussed with them, and also kind of give you a high-level view into that. So let's start off with the Enterprise edition here, and I'm going to start with that one because all of the releases below that and all the additions below that have been kind of included in the higher releases. So if you're on standard, you have a certain amount of features. In business intelligence, you also have the standard features, and Enterprise again has the business intelligence and standard features. So Always On was a great new feature that was added in the 2012 estate. And this was the capability of taking one or more databases and allowing that to basically be recoverable onto a second system for high availability capacity. And that allows us to keep that database and more databases that may be related to that in a tight group that we can then fail over to a second system when the need requires, maybe for maintenance purposes or failure of hardware or software services at that level. In addition to that capability, we had the X-Velocity in-memory data warehouse technologies. It's also known as column store indexing. And this effectively was a different storage format than we previously had been using. So we used to use row storage format for all of the database platforms up into the 2012 release. We brought in this additional capability where we can use it in a column versioned storage format. That is, each column has all its data pages aligned inside the storage engine. What this means is, from a performance standpoint, is that we're able to get a much smaller footprint for that data storage, but also predominantly the batch processing capability that came along with that allows us to process those data warehouse workloads in a much smaller time frame than previously was available. We can move on to the business intelligence. This is a new addition that was added in 2012. And we've got, you can see in the gray kind of color here, a lot of different capabilities. Power View, this was added to the Power Pivot we already had for Excel and SharePoint. We also have reporting services data alerts, so making awareness of when data's changed and the underlying structures of that system for reporting. Data quality services, that was another capability that added to the master data services here. We've got lots and lots of new features here that I don't have time to go into the detail of, but as you can see, there's something for every single edition there. And the SQL Server Data Tools was a richness of development environment, allowed us to be much kind of highly performing in terms of our development processes, the capabilities for debugging processes, etc. I'm going to move on to the 2014 one now, and this is when we basically had a new feature that really came in that really kind of changed the landscape for the OLTP environment. So we previously had the data warehouse column store that allowed the data warehouse systems to run much quicker. The OLTP in memory, also known as Hackathon, is allowed us to take some of those data table structures and place them in in-memory objects, and also align with that the native compilation of code into a much faster way of executing that code without having to compile it on each execution run. So this means that we were getting magnitude increases in performance. The example I'm showing here is one that's over 14 times faster or more throughput capability than we previously were able to get from the previous kind of row processing model that we had before. There's also some increases in the amount of memory that the standard edition was allowed to process, etc. That's not the only features that we were talking about. There's a vast array. In fact, actually, even this list that's shown here doesn't kind of encompass every single feature. But let me just cover off some of the main ones here. So the always-on feature I've already mentioned, that allowed us to kind of throw that database from one server to another in a much highly kind of high availability capability. We have the column store indexes I mentioned also. Things like partitioning, we now have moved from 1,000 to 15,000 partitions. There's a whole array of T-SQL enhancements around the coding capability, so paging functionality inside of the window in sets that we have now. There's also things around database recovery advisor, PowerShell integration at the PowerShell 2 level that allows us to manage the estate on a much more kind of tightly integrated way with SQL Server itself, and kind of having multiple servers being managed with maybe one script instead of having multiple scripts to perform that. With the 2014 estate, we basically have obviously the in-memory Hackathon OLTP, and there's some vast improvements in performance around that. Other things like buffer pool enhancements. So this is making use of SSD technology, where we're basically going to enhance that amount of buffer pool array. So that's the clean store pages inside of the memory that allows us to get that performance out of the SQL Server for when it processes the data. We also moved into the clustered column store capability. So this is basically enhancing the clustered column store that came in 2012, but making it a writable version of this. We had some non-clustered version of this before, but we could only write it once, and then effectively it was locked, and we had some capability issues around keeping that updated as data changed underneath that. This now effectively is a much more scalable way of keeping that data for data warehouses. One, it's not an additional index anymore, it's actually replacing the base data. So the actual amount of data storage it requires is a much smaller footprint than it was, and I've seen it in kind of 10 times or more reduction in size of the amount of data. So a 20 gig table now is below the 2 gig framework before. We have a huge increase in scalability. So as a physical server, we can now go to massive scale with 4 terabyte RAM and up to 640 logical processors, if that was the need. We can also go to a much higher virtualization footprint as well. So we can go to 64 virtual processors and up to 1 terabyte of RAM per virtual instance here. So the largest kind of installations you have today, effectively you can go and virtualize that now. There's things around additional kind of performance and manageability of the system. So one of the ones that we brought in was Resource Governor I/O. So effectively before we could manage memory and CPU, but we didn't have the I/O capability of scaling that and working out if the workloads were over using the I/O subsystem. So we can control that more now. And if you tie that in with things like the storage tiering and other capabilities inside of the engine, like the always-on availability systems, we can really now kind of make sure that we're making use of the right technology with the right amount of resources assigned to that. Obviously, the cloud is a huge kind of move forward for the Microsoft data platform. So we now have tight integration with Windows Azure. We can back up directly into the cloud. We can also move the Azure always-on availability groups, as they're known, and put some of those mutable secondaries into the cloud as well. So some of this may make no sense to you at all, the terms I'm using, but if you're a DBA and you're a developer and you're using these kind of enterprise features or features that really can leverage your capabilities in the system, these are huge steps forward in terms of what we're able to do with the system today. And of course, business intelligence is a large area where we want to kind of continue to increase our usage and capability in that. So we have some new ones like Data Explorer and GeoFlow, and this is just making this a much more richer environment for us to move forward for that. So I'm going to kind of go through a little bit, a couple of examples here of combining the few features and why you would probably maybe be looking to do that in the estate if you migrated or were installing new editions of SQL Server. The first one I'm going to cover here is the buffer pool extension and the in-memory hackathon. Now, effectively, SQL Server traditionally and the in-memory version uses memory to process its data. It has to bring that data into memory first and then process it. Well, if we use SSDs to extend the clean pages that we can store for SQL Server to access, and we can back those up by an SSD, this means that we can actually free up some of the RAM that we were using previously for that purpose and make that available for in-memory capabilities. So that really plays nicely together when we look at those two technologies in use. In order to achieve that, we probably need to identify which of the code and which of the tables are actually kind of suitable for in-memory capabilities. So we might want to use the master management data warehouse capability. And there's a tool called AMR, which is the Analyze Migration Reporting tool, that looks at the workloads that are being run on the server and identifies which ones are suitable for an in-memory usage case. And here's one of the ones where we were showing that example of 14 times increase by actually identifying some of the objects that previously were being processed and they could be migrated to an in-memory version. I also touched on the I/O governance earlier and the online index rebuild, which is kind of in the 2014 estate, and basically being able to do an individual data partition and rebuild that as an online operation is only just becoming available now in this release. So that's really been able to kind of leverage with limiting the amount of IOs a certain thread or connection is making and using and limiting from in that IO. We're able to now really control how much IO is being used by, say, the maintenance processes that we want to do. And that allows us to keep the main resource available, the IO subsystem CPU, available to kind of work on our our key performance problems, which is the processing of that data for our business processes. In order to do that, we need to have some understanding about the workloads that are going on the system, and maybe get some experience with somebody to come in and figure out how to set up resource governance to set that up for a kind of suitable environment for your system. So before we kind of migrate or do any other kind of upgrades or refreshes of a system, we want to probably understand the reasoning behind why we're doing this. So one of the first things I do find when people are considering moving from an earlier version of SQL Server 2008 or below is that, one, it's maybe because they have to leverage a new feature that's available in the later release. But also it could be that they're actually, for example, now at a mainstream support for the SQL Server product. So the life cycle of SQL Server is pretty much on a 5-year live and then 5-year extended cycle. And 2008 and 2008 R2 are now, in July of early this year, we came out of mainstream support. We're in extended support framework now. So this is an additional cost for your licensing that you're going to have to cover if you want to have maintenance support. And 2005 actually is completely coming to the end of its support in 2016. So you've only got about a year or so left, pretty much before you won't be able to buy support for that version as well. So in order to figure out how to kind of get the best from your estate, you want to kind of look at what workloads you're running and how well you can actually maybe consolidate those down. This is one of the things I find a lot of people doing when they're moving to the later release. They're actually saying, well, I have 3 or 4 servers, but when I look at the workloads across them, maybe I can consolidate all of them or a few of those together to reduce my number of server overhead that I'm running here. And also that's going to reduce the number of servers you run, the licensing requirements for all those servers, and also the footprint and the estate management, so the power that you're going to use in that data center, for example. All of those are reduced. And you require probably some audits and resource planning in order to achieve that effectively, rather than just trying to put everything on one box and hoping for the best. We have life cycles in hardware refresh, and there's usually kind of around a 3 or 5 year time cycle for that. There's because of older systems obviously are replaced with much faster processors, newer architecture, and the flash technologies have really kind of made a difference over the last few years here. So one of the things that we are looking at is, are you ready for now a hardware refresh? Does it make sense? Can you leverage that new capability inside those CPUs? Some of the new technologies like the batch processing are actually leveraged against the new processor architecture. So in order to get the most out of those, you probably want to be looking at those new processors. So in order to replace your hardware, you're probably going to want to look at your performance levels of how your system's performing, what workloads you're currently running on those, and how many servers you're actually using to facilitate all those workloads across multiple servers. Can that be reduced? Can you actually kind of take that number down to a smaller number by putting on much more performant hardware, etc., and possibly looking at kind of the flash technologies for faster subsystem processing. In addition to that, the OS itself is a key component or part of the database platform. So SQL Server as a service runs on an OS. So having the right OS and also the licensing, again, the lifecycle management of that process is really key in order to kind of getting the best out of that. Now, for 2014 and 2012, the Windows Server 2012 R2 edition has some great new features around it in order to really help with the heavy I/O capabilities and requirements for those servers. So we have the new storage spaces features that's come in. We have the service message block SM3 capability that allows us to take that. So in order to get the maximum performance out of your SQL Server, you need to make sure you're running on the right OS as well. So there's no discussion for SQL Server would not be right without kind of talking about virtualization and the Azure SQL Database platforms. So first off, let's talk about virtualization here. Having the ability to take your workload and place SQL Server on a virtual image that you can then have the capability and flexibility of assigning the right level of resources at the right time. So effectively having that flexibility of assigning for those peak loads of systems, a little bit more memory or CPU from some of the other servers that maybe don't require exactly that workload at that time. So we really have some high virtualization capabilities now, and if you use an enterprise edition with, say, the SA, you can really kind of have unvirtualized virtualization now, and that can really help you with kind of the amount of licensing costs across all your VMs. SQL Azure Database. So obviously in recent times we've had the capability now to run SQL Server workloads in the cloud. Now this feature has been maturing over the last kind of couple of years, and the size of the databases we can deploy in that have gone up quite substantially over that time. We're now up to over 500 gig, or around 500 gig per database SQL instance that we can run in the cloud. It comes in effectively 3 different performance tiers here. So the basic tier is really for those very small internal kind of application workloads that you might have for your department, and you're not too concerned about maybe the transactions rate per that you're going to run on that. So it has a predictable hourly transaction rate here, and we can go up to 16,000 odd 6 transactions per hour, you know, up to 300 sessions, and it's pretty good. But the maximum size is only around the 2 gigabyte size. So this is really for that small internal kind of application there. Our standard tier is that kind of predominantly cloud design business application level. So this is that mid-tier business continuity features. We have much higher transaction levels, and we're basically down to the per minute transaction rates than we previously were at the per hour. So we've gone forward quite a lot in terms of the capability, and we're up to 250 gig in terms of the size of the database here now. And then we have our premium tier, which allows us to have those mission critical workloads now placed into the cloud. We're up to 500 gigs of data, but we have a huge number of transactions that we can run now. We're in the per second range for this. So, and there's some additional new capabilities around the SSD capability that they're making available for these as well. So if you have a heavy workload, you can probably put this in the cloud now. So we're kind of going to move on in the last minute here I have, just to talk around a couple of examples of some of the things we were talking about. So we were talking about high availability. It's a dominant business feature that people need to have in their estate these days. So here I'm showing a couple of examples. So the first one I'm going to show is the one on the left-hand side, where we have what's known as a failover cluster instance. So this is 2 physical or virtual instances that we have. We have one as an active one, and we'll have one that possibly is in a passive node. So in 2012 terms, this means that we only had to license the active node, and the passive node required no additional licensing if it was totally in a passive capacity. We can also run this in an active configuration as well, and that requires both of those nodes to be licensed. And we can see here we've got an example of 24 core licenses, 12 on each of the instances that we are running as an active node here. And this can be, this is a 2 node, but we can have 4, 8 nodes, etc. The one on the right hand bottom is giving us the ability to show that we can have multiple secondaries. And then effectively, if we were doing the ones where we're going to actually have that on there, we wanted to have the ability to license a 2nd or 3rd or 4th secondary for disaster recovery or additional availability maybe in different data centers around the world here. And finally, on the last slide here, I'm just going to show one that combines both the high availability and disaster recoverability, which is the always-on failed cluster instances, as well as the availability groups for disaster recoverability across the sites. And this shows that kind of we have the dashboards, we have the management studio interface to allow us to easily manage this interface and kind of control and see exactly where we are from a synchronization standpoint. So I've kind of covered a lot of ground here in 20 minutes. I'm now going to pass back over to Jack. But obviously you can see there's a lot of things that we can talk about using SQL 2012 and 2014. Jack, it's back over to you, sir.
Thank you, Neil. So in light of the complexity of SQL licensing, there are really 4 key areas for your consideration at the back of this webinar. The first is to see if there's a review of the SQL licensing estate for potential opportunities and risks. Now, this is not an audit. It's more advice on how to best analyze your software assets, look at the inventory and analysis of your SQL estate, what software is installed and what licenses you own, at what edition and what version, whether you're using cross or downgrade rights within the product usage rights of each of those individual versions, taking into account all the variables that make SQL licensing complex, and then looking at the licensing implications for your live and planned projects. Secondly, we're looking at how to maximize the value from SQL Server licensing more generally. An expert evaluation of your current software licensing contract, what contractual obligations you have, what mandatory true-ups or renewals you may have further down the line, and preparing for upcoming contract negotiations. Now what we're looking at here is optimizing the current and newly negotiated license agreements from Microsoft to ensure you're getting the full value from all of your software investments, whether that be now, future, but also the historical investment that you've made already. Particularly what we want to zero in on this piece of work is looking at the SA migrations and the move from a SQL processor to core metric. It's a phenomenal opportunity within that space. Thirdly, looking at the planning service days and application platform workshops, many of you who have active software assurance on your volume licenses will have SQL Server Deployment Planning Services days or SSDPs days. And using these software assurance benefit days, it's effectively consultancy, complementary consultancy that can be provided off the back of your current license agreement to look at the license implications of your live and planned projects and plan the best route ahead. We can talk to you about how best to migrate on-premise license agreements to the cloud. We can also look at a concise and tailored document that states your objectives, your future licensing considerations, and advise on maximizing your current investment. So you can currently utilize your existing assets and then look at the suggested working practices and recommendations moving forward. And fourth and lastly, and I know Richard's going to contribute to this before we close today, there's an opportunity to understand how you can consolidate and reduce the impact for a move to a core-based licensing model, and also looking at the underlying hardware, the operating system, and improving performance. SQL workloads in the cloud using our cloud solution specialists at Bytes is another area that we can expand upon, and looking at SQL mobility and the licensing rules of that via someone like myself as a licensing specialist can really help. It's the best fit for your individual infrastructure. A half-day storage review is also an offer with a view to looking at the technology that underpins your data and management and storage of your databases. So with that, I'll just hand back over to Richard.
That's great, thanks Jack, thank you very much. So I think that really gives everybody an idea that there's quite a lot to consider from a licensing perspective, from a design perspective, a SQL estate design perspective, from perhaps looking at the platform that the SQL estate's running from. And I guess it's probably worth saying North will have a huge amount of experience working with our customers and our partners' customers when it comes to helping you guys to get the optimum value from the estate. Off the back of this webinar, we are offering a sort of a deal to the Bytes' customers, which will last until the 31st of December 2014. And that is that if you wanted to purchase 2 days of our consultancy, we would offer a third day at no charge. So that's a great offer, and we can help with a variety of different areas. So we could help with just the design aspect if you wanted some advice and consultancy around what's going to be the most appropriate design. But we do have the people within the organisation if you wanted us to help with implementing that design and providing ongoing support services, if that was something that you might want us to help with. We've worked with Bytes for many years. We have a great relationship with their account managers, and we can work in conjunction with the Bytes account managers to make sure you're getting the best advice for licensing, and you're also getting the best advice when it comes to the actual estate itself and the design and configuration. So off the back of that, I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thank you very much. So that's all for now for the webinar. At this point, we'll just open up to any questions that you may have. I know some people have popped some questions in as we've gone through. So if I just get those out now. So Rodney has asked, can you clarify the standard licensing of a VM host and the one-on-one relationship you mentioned, please?
So it's a good question. So in its current guise, if you're licensing or procuring a license for SQL Server 2014 and it's a standard edition, effectively that standard edition, if you're licensing on a per VM basis, each standard edition license will cover you for that VM. Because it's on a server cow model and it's a server license itself, you will require cows and client access licenses for anybody directly or indirectly accessing that server and that virtual VM. But effectively, it's irrespective of the number of processors or virtual cores that are going to be assigned to that virtual machine. So in this instance, effectively, if you have a single host, regardless of what hypervisor, I'll call it a VMware host for the sake of the explanation, and you have 2 SQL Server virtual machines running on that host, then you will require 2 SQL Server standard licenses, 1 for each of those virtual machines. Now, as you scale, hopefully that answers the question, but as you scale with the footprint of SQL VMs on that particular host, you will then move to perhaps it being more advantageous to license on an enterprise edition model, and that's because it scales with the inclusion of software assurance to giving you unlimited virtualization rights, or without software assurance having the rights to actually license 4 virtual machines for every 4 cores in the physical host that you're covering.
Lovely, thank you. And we've got a question here from Louise who says, when downgrading from a 2014 with software assurance purchase to 2008, are we able to utilise the functionality of 2008 even if this is not present in the 2014 edition?
So absolutely, yes, you can use functionality-wise, you can absolutely use the functionality of that lower version, so that's not a problem at all. The only thing that I would say from a licensing perspective is you'd have to adhere to the licensing rules of 2014, even though in that instance you've got an earlier version deployed. But functionality-wise, you're absolutely free to do that.
Lovely, thank you. And a question here from Paul who says, hi Jack, please can you confirm that a physical server with a single quad-core processor with HT enabled would only need 4 core licenses for SQL, but if it was a virtual server with the same process, it would need 8 core licenses?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I can confirm that, and it's a perfect question to kind of illustrate the difference from physical to virtual. So what you're saying then is absolutely correct. I can confirm it, and for the benefit to reiterate it back to anyone else that may be in a similar situation, it's very keen. We're very keen to look at people with a mix of physical and virtual environments, and it's always one of the difficulties that you have from a software asset management perspective is actually looking at the licensing rules and how they are applied to what you're actually doing physically or virtually within your estate. So to confirm that from a physical perspective, hyperthreading is not an issue or consideration that you need to worry about, but if you're virtualizing and you have virtual cores or threads assigned to individual virtual VMs, then you will need to effectively, in many cases, double your licensing requirement to accommodate the fact that individual hardware threads could be allocated to virtual machines.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And a question from Tracy who says, with regards to the SSDPs, can we use those days within our agreement to engage with a preferred consultancy of our choice?
So yes, effectively those are your planning, SSDPs planning days. Natively you get them as part of your enterprise or software assurance investment, whatever license agreement you may have, and you are free to use that with any accredited provider. Now what you will also have is a choice within using those with partners in terms of how you want to use them. It's very prescriptive, and it's something that we can certainly follow up individually for you to talk about what is actually delivered as part of those days, because there are areas of flexibility. Some partners are more flexible than others, as well as having a greater level of understanding of SQL.
Lovely, thank you. And Mike's got a question. What are the differences for external and internal access with SQL Server 2014 licensing?
So it's a continuation of what was prevalent with SQL Server 2012, in that if you have a SQL database that is directly or indirectly accessed by external parties, effectively if it's a quantifiable number of users, you can purchase a server license for them. If it's standard edition, obviously you can't buy those for enterprise anymore, and then purchase the number of cows, that quantifiable number of cows for those people that are going to be accessing that database. If that is an unquantifiable number, or if it's a significantly large number, then it will force you to have to license on what is today the core licensing metric. So that's a continuation of what was already in play with SQL Server 2012. hopefully that clarifies areas where effectively there's a break-even point if there is a quantifiable external users to actually look at, is it best to license it server cal or is it best to license it core? And obviously we'll have to take into account the underlying hardware specifications as well as how many users are going to be using it now, but also in the future. And I think what this perhaps evolves, and it's something that we've not mentioned in the webinar, but for everybody to keep in the forefront of their mind, is that if you use Enterprise Edition and you're forced down this core licensing model, and you can't purchase the server Enterprise Edition licenses anymore, then suddenly CALs become a bit of a question mark in terms of the future procurement and investment on your client access licenses. Because if you're going to have to either now or in the very near future move to a core licensing metric, if you went core licensing across your entire organization, you would not need CALs. Currently, Microsoft have no metric or migration to take that investment on client access licenses and convert, credit, or in some way discount the subsequent purchase of core licensing. So it's something to be mindful. With or without software assurance, what shall I do about my CAL procurement moving forward? A fantastic area for us to zero in on and deliver some value for you.
Great, thank you. And Barrington has got a question here. On physical server deployments, do you need to cover hyperthreading, or is this only within the virtual world?
It's only within the virtual world.
Lovely, thank you. And Darren's got a question. We use mirroring 2008 R2, so we don't need to license the mirror server. If we purchase 2014 but install 2012, will we need to license the mirror server?
If you have active software assurance, you will not need to license that mirrored server. If you don't have software assurance, then effectively you would have to adhere to the 2014 rights, which say that you do need to license the mirrored server because you don't have active SA. So an example, perfect example, whereby you're buying or forced to purchase the latest and greatest in terms of licensed version. You want to downgrade it and use for a lower version or indeed edition, but you'd have to adhere to those higher rights. So in that example, it's fairly clean cut.
I'm just going to quickly add to that. We probably already know, but we actually deprecated the mirroring capability. So although it's still available in the 2014 release, it's actually kind of been marked for deprecation at some point. So kind of if you're looking to continue to use mirroring, you probably want to maybe kind of consider the replacement of that, which is like the always-on availability group capability. It has much more kind of scalability and performance through it, and also has kind of some additional capabilities that mirroring doesn't have. So I just wanted to add that in as well.
Lovely, thank you. And the next question here, what exactly is the definition of indirect access to a SQL database to identify if CALs are required?
So it's a rather lengthy one. It's actually detailed within the product usage rights itself. So what I can do is I'll take the details and actually make that available and upload it to the copy of the slides that we'll be providing for everyone, because it is a word-for-word explanation from Microsoft contained within their product use rights documents. The PER, as it's commonly referred to, is a sort of almost 150-page document Microsoft bring out on a monthly basis, which shows the individual licensing rights for the versions and editions that you may be deploying. So it's very good. It's freely available on the Microsoft website, and it's a good source for any sort of particular queries that you might have around actual deployments. For my own piece, and to deliver some immediate kind of value back on that, is that typically what people will have, and historically we've found, is that there will be a SQL database, and then on the back end and the front end some form of application. Let's use SharePoint as a good example. You might have a lot of organizations with, let's say, 100 users accessing that SharePoint server. Now they don't directly access the SQL database, but obviously SharePoint is presenting the SQL services in some manner, and that is indirect access, and it still requires a client access license. The theme or the banner in which all this comes under is multiplexing, and the multiplexing issue is very much for sort of things like batch jobs and such like. Microsoft still require a client access license for that, unless you have business intelligence, and that's the one exception to the rule. If you have Business Intelligence Edition of SQL Server 2014, then it does allow for those batch jobs, and it does mitigate many of those multiplexing situations.
It uses a pool kind of set of connections, so you can kind of reuse that pool. You might have 10 connections that you're reusing, but you can only go up to 10 connections at a time, for example. So.
Great, thank you. And Paul asks, if you license a virtual host for Enterprise Edition, would that also need licenses for HT?
So a similar kind of iteration of what we've already covered from a hyper-threading perspective. If you are licensing the physical host, then hyper-threading isn't an issue if you're going to be licensing all the physical cores in that host. So the two licensing models in a virtual environment, license per VM, where hyper-threading does affect you, or licensing for the number of physical cores in the host. In this question and this example, we're talking about the latter. So hyper-threading is not something that has a significant impact or an impact here. All you need to do is make sure you license all the physical cores in that host. And Microsoft, what they don't allow for is soft partitioning. So effectively, even if you're only presenting in that virtual environment a certain number of those physical cores, if you choose to go down that model of licensing, you've got to cover all of them. And I think that's a very common area where a lot of organizations, if you're highly virtualized from a SQL virtualization perspective, then that's great. You get unlimited virtualization rights. It's a very cost-effective way of doing it, and a very good way of using the software assurance investment that you'll have over those licenses. But it is something that you perhaps need to be mindful as when people are designing and building these new SQL environments, consolidated SQL environments that we're seeing a great deal of. They typically, the licensing comes in quite late, so it doesn't actually influence the specification of the underlying hardware. So you can end up with 4 hex core processors in that example and have to license core licensing across the lot with software assurance, a significant sum of money. So hopefully what this webinar will do, and the answering to this question, will give you a greater level of insight in terms of some of the questions that may need to be asked along that, but also what other alternatives there may be when you're consolidating the SQL databases, such as the Windows Flash Array from Violin.
Lovely. And we've just got time for one more question. Regarding Azure, is there a ballpark number of servers, number of databases, transactions, or other metric that very generally indicates if it is a better fit than on-premise SQL servers, please?
I'll take this one probably. So the kind of workload that you're running on there, we kind of have this term called DTU, which is database transaction units. So Azure kind of has it can do so many transaction units per kind of time frame. You need to work out kind of what that looks like for your estate and kind of work out which then tier and which performance level you need to be running on for that. Work out the costs involved with that, the capability, and then you will then see whether that's actually going to be a good fit for you for your estate. Now, over the last couple of years, that's really kind of ramped up, and we're finding now that most workloads we're looking at can fit into one of those performance tiers very easily, and it's just figuring out which one that is. And that's something that kind of needs to be sit down and kind of work out what those characteristics are and kind of get some advice around that. But you'll be surprised at how capable these systems are. Remember, this is a 2014 engine under the covers, and it's highly performant in terms of its I/O and network capabilities. So you kind of really do need to look at whether this is something that's going to kind of be the right fit for you from a workload perspective.
Just to chime in there, we do have the ability, and it very much plays to our strengths from a cloud solution specialist side of things, to do precisely that and look at those workloads, see what works, what fits, how to get there, and help you understand and plan the migration, or whether it's even something worth looking at. But those type of environments, those type of questions are phenomenal opportunities for us to get involved and actually help you understand what can move and migrate to the cloud.
Remember, you can also migrate off the cloud back into an actual virtual instance or onto an on-premise system. So have capability of going up to cloud, but also at the right time maybe coming back to a more performant dedicated system for that as well.
just a final kind of thought on that, just to put a licensing overlay on it. Always keen to kind of to cover the licensing implications of this. There'll be a lot of customers that are using Azure, thinking of using Azure, or indeed any other cloud-based platform. And one of the things you certainly want to be mindful of is the mobility of your SQL licenses. Are you paying for the SQL licenses as part of the consumption of that service? Is that the most cost-effective route? Or are you using your on-premise licenses and using the SA mobility to license what you're putting up there in the cloud? How do you manage that? What are the complexities around that? It's actually a formal process that you have to go through from a Microsoft perspective, one that's poorly communicated to date across the channel, but certainly one that we've got a lot of maturity and a lot of experience in helping you understand what those implications are.
Lovely. Well, that's all that we've got time for today. So thank you very much to Neil, Richard and Jack for presenting for us today.